The courtroom was supposed to be Merrick Garland's stage. Calm, composed, and in complete control. Instead, it turned into the scene of a jaw-dropping reversal. The cameras panned across tense faces, reporters scribbling, spectators holding their breath. Then, like a lightning strike, on a clear day, Jasmine. Crockett's voice cut through the silence. Her words weren't gentle or cautious. They were precise, fierce, and utterly devastating. Garland, who built his reputation on steady authority and careful restraint, suddenly looked caught off guard. For years, he'd been the man others scrambled to keep up with, the one who dictated tempo. But this time, he was the one scrambling. Crockett's defense wasn't just an argument, it was a dismantling, piece by piece, of Garland's confidence. The courtroom leaned in. Every sentence landed heavier than the last. And when she paused, letting her silence speak, louder than Garland's, the shift in power was unmistakable. The spectators knew it. The press knew it. Even Garland knew it. Subscribe now, because if this moment left Garland stunned, what follows will leave the entire country in disbelief. Don't miss the rest of the story. But Crockett didn't stop. She wasn't defending a case. She was defending the very idea that truth should never bow to power. Her tone sharpened with each phrase, her words echoing beyond the walls of the courtroom. Phones lit up, messages spread, and in real time, the narrative flipped. The man once seen as untouchable was suddenly on the defensive, left struggling to regain control of his own stage. By the time her final line dropped, the room was silent, not out of respect, but out of shock. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just defended her ground, she had seized it. And in doing so, she left Merrick Garland with nothing but silence, a silence louder than any gavel's strike. What happened in that room wasn't the climax, it was the spark. And the firestorm it unleashed was only just beginning. What unfolded in that courtroom wasn't just another legal back and forth. It was a moment loaded with consequence. Behind every phrase Jasmine Crockett delivered stood the weight of a broader fight, truth against manipulation, dignity against dismissal, and the voice of everyday Americans against the machinery of power. Garland's silence wasn't ordinary hesitation. It was symbolic. To many, it represented how the old guard struggles to respond when confronted by unshakable conviction. For Garland's supporters, it was uncomfortable. For his critics, it was vindication. But for the rest of America, watching through live streams and endless replays, it became something bigger, a test of whether courage can actually puncture the shield of establishment authority. Crockett's defense wasn't about scoring cheap points. It was about putting the nation's values on trial. The stakes were no longer confined to the four walls of that courtroom. Every viewer knew it. If Garland, the face of institutional order, could be shaken, then the balance of influence itself was shifting. The buzz didn't stop at the courthouse steps. Commentators scrambled to frame the moment. Was Garland losing his grip on credibility? Or was Crockett simply exposing a truth long ignored? Social media lit up with hashtags, looping clips, and captions that turned seconds of silence into a symbol of defeat. And yet this was only the setup. Because the question on everyone's mind wasn't just what Crockett had said, it was how Garland would respond next. Would he find his footing? Or had she permanently unseated him in the eyes of the public? The silence in that room had already changed the conversation. But the confrontation that followed would take the drama to heights no one could have imagined. To understand why this moment landed with such force, you have to understand Merrick Garland. For years, he embodied the establishment's idea of stability: calm, reserved, unflappable. He carried himself as the man who never lost control, whose measured tone could quiet a storm before it began. In many ways, he was seen as untouchable, a figure who represented the authority of the system itself. But beneath that polished exterior, cracks had long been forming. Garland's critics saw him as cautious to the point of weakness, a man who often hesitated when decisive action was demanded. For some, he was the symbol of bureaucracy, slow, procedural, and unwilling to take risks that might rattle the status quo. His silence, once praised as poise, was increasingly seen as avoidance. That's why the silence in this courtroom stung so much. It wasn't just Garland pausing. It was Garland, confirming every doubt whispered about him. For years, his opponents accused him of hiding behind process instead of leading with conviction. And here, in real time, he seemed to prove them right. The aura of invincibility began to slip. Cameras caught every twitch, every blink, every moment where words failed him. To the public, it didn't look like patience anymore. It looked like paralysis. And when you're facing an opponent as sharp and unapologetic as Jasmine Crockett, paralysis is fatal. This was the man who was supposed to be the face of composure. Instead, he was suddenly the face of vulnerability. The very qualities that once shielded him, restraint, detachment, carefulness, were being recast as weaknesses. Crockett wasn't just challenging his words. She was rewriting his image before millions of watching eyes. And as Garland's silence stretched on, the unspoken truth became unavoidable. The establishment giant was not untouchable. He could be rattled. He could be exposed. And in this moment, his reputation was slipping away faster than he could grasp it. But while Garland was unraveling, the real question became, who was Jasmine Crockett? And how did she step into this courtroom storm ready to turn it all upside down? Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that courtroom as just another attorney or lawmaker. She carried a lifetime of battles on her shoulders. Long before the cameras started rolling, before her words silenced the most powerful figures in Washington, Crockett had been fighting for something bigger than herself. Born into a working-class family, she knew early on what it meant to navigate systems that weren't built for people like her. She wasn't handed power. She fought for every inch of it, from long nights buried in case law to days spent defending those who couldn't afford a voice. Crockett built her reputation on being relentless. Not reckless, but relentless. Her story isn't one of privilege, it's one of grit. She saw communities ignored, rights trampled, and lives dismissed. And instead of bowing her head, she rose. Every courtroom she entered was another arena. Every client another chance to prove that justice doesn't belong to the elite. It belongs to everyone. And that spirit followed her into politics. While others spoke in carefully scripted lines, Crockett spoke with raw clarity. She didn't try to mimic the establishment. She challenged it. Her words weren't rehearsed, they were lived. They came from experience, from scars, from a belief that courage should never be optional. That's why, on this day, when Garland faltered, she didn't hesitate. Crockett wasn't intimidated by the institution he represented. To her, it was just another system that needed to be held accountable. Where others might have shrunk, she stepped forward. Her voice carried not just the weight of her own journey, but the struggles of countless others who had been overlooked. And that's what made her defense so powerful. It wasn't just strategy, it was survival, resilience and truth woven together. This was the woman now standing toe-to-toe with Merrick Garland. And as her backstory reveals, she wasn't built to play small. She was built for moments exactly like this. Moments that shake the foundation of power and remind the world that courage can come from anywhere. The air was thick, the kind of silence that hums louder than noise. Garland adjusted his papers, clearly trying to regain control. But Crockett was already 2 steps ahead. Her eyes locked on him, not with hostility, but with unshakable determination. The courtroom felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. Garland finally spoke, his tone clipped, his words carefully measured. He attempted to reframe, to pull the conversation back into his comfort zone of procedure and precedent. But Crockett wasn't about to let him dictate the rhythm. She cut in, not rudely, but firmly, reminding everyone that this wasn't about process, it was about truth. Every time Garland tried to steady the ground, Crockett shook it beneath his feet. He leaned on legal jargon. She dismantled it with plain language that cut straight to the core. He raised his voice slightly, grasping for authority, making the entire room strain to hear every word. The contrast was devastating. Whispers spread among the spectators. Reporters exchanged glances. Even Garland's allies shifted uneasily, sensing the balance slipping. It wasn't just a clash of arguments. It was a clash of styles, of worlds. Garland spoke for the institution. Crockett spoke for the people. And in that moment, the people were winning. By the time she delivered her final line in that exchange, Garland's jaw tightened. He had answers, yes, but they no longer carried weight. Crockett wasn't just debating him, she was redefining him, exposing the frailty behind the facade of composure. The escalation was undeniable, the tension unbearable, and everyone watching knew it was only building toward a showdown no one would forget. And then it happened, the moment no one in that courtroom could have predicted. Garland leaned back, preparing to press his point once more, but before he could even draw a breath, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward. Her tone dropped, steady and calm, but each word carried the force of a hammer striking steel. "Mr. Garland," she began, "you talk about precedent, you talk about procedure, but let's talk about the people. Let's talk about the promises this system made and broke." The courtroom froze. She wasn't just addressing him. She was putting the entire institution on trial. She unfolded receipts, one after another, failures ignored, voices silenced, rights dismissed. And with each example, Garland's carefully constructed armor cracked. He tried to interject once, raising his hand ever so slightly, but Crockett wasn't giving him an escape. She paused just long enough to let the silence hang, the kind of pause that twists the knife deeper, before continuing with even sharper precision. Her rhythm was flawless. Build, pause, strike. Build, pause, strike. The spectators felt it like waves crashing harder each time, until the entire room was drowning in the weight of her words. Phones buzzed as reporters furiously typed, trying to capture lightning in text. Crockett leaned back, her work done. One final glance at Garland said it all. This wasn't about winning a point. This was about reclaiming power, about proving that the system could be held accountable, even by a voice it never expected. And as the echoes of her words filled the chamber, one question lingered. How would the world beyond this courtroom react to what they had just witnessed? The courtroom may have been where it happened, but the fallout didn't stay there for long. Within minutes of Crockett's final line, phones lit up like fireworks. Clips spread across social media at lightning speed. Dr. Garland's silence trended within the hour. Hashtags praising Crockett stacked one after another. Truth wins. Crockett strong, our courtroom clapback. On TikTok, creators stitched her words into edits that looped endlessly, while Twitter lit up with political commentators calling it the moment the establishment cracked. For Garland, the silence was more than personal embarrassment. It was symbolic. It painted him as the face of a system that buckled under scrutiny. For Crockett, the surge of attention only cemented her as a rising force, the one who dared to speak when others stayed quiet. But the story didn't end with hashtags or headlines. The real question was, how would this moment reshape the conversation about justice and power in America? And more importantly, what lesson would the nation take from a courtroom clash that stunned even the most? Jaded observers? News anchors scrambled to adjust their scripts. What was supposed to be a routine? Courtroom update transformed into the story of the day. Some networks ran Crockett's mic drop line on repeat, dissecting every syllable. Others framed it as a dangerous shift in tone, proof that establishment figures like Garland were losing their grip. But the reaction that mattered most came from ordinary people, in community centers, on college campuses, in break rooms and barber shops. People replayed her words and nodded. She wasn't just speaking as a lawyer, she was speaking as someone who had lived what so many had felt. Celebrities weighed in too. A-list actors tweeted their support. Musicians quoted her line, and activists praised her courage. Crockett had crossed the invisible line from politician to cultural figure, a name now tied to defiance and truth. When the noise settled, when the tweets slowed, the headlines shifted, and the courtroom emptied, one truth remained. Jasmine Crockett had reminded the nation that power isn't measured by position, but by courage. Her defense wasn't just a momentary triumph over Merrick Garland. It was a statement about what it means to stand firm when silence is easier, in a system often criticized for being slow, rigid, and detached. She injected something rare, clarity and conviction. For many watching, it wasn't about Garland at all. It was about the idea that no one, no matter how established or untouchable they seem, is beyond accountability. Crockett's words echoed because they weren't rehearsed. They were lived. She wasn't defending herself alone. She was defending dignity, justice, and the voices of countless people who've long felt unheard. And that's why her message resonated so deeply. It told every young person, every immigrant family, every community sidelined by the system, that truth still has a place in the halls of power. That a single voice, sharpened by conviction, can cut through decades of polished indifference. Garland's silence may have been the headline, but Crockett's defiance was the lesson. The clash wasn't about who had more authority. It was about who had more authenticity. And in the end, authenticity carried the day. Moments like this remind us why we pay attention, why we care about these battles that unfold in sterile rooms, with wooden benches and marble walls. Because in those rooms, the future is being written, not by those who cling to titles, but by those bold enough to speak when it matters most. And Crockett's voice? It will not be forgotten. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just another heated exchange. It was a turning point. Merrick Garland, long seen as unflappable, was left in silence. And Jasmine Crockett, fueled by conviction and unapologetic truth, stood taller than ever. It wasn't simply about who won an argument. It was about who represented the future. Crockett showed us that power doesn't always flow from titles or positions. Sometimes it comes from standing in the fire and refusing to back down. Her words, sharp and unforgettable, carried further than any gavel strike. They spoke for the people who've waited too long for justice to sound like them. And that's why this moment matters. Because beyond the headlines, beyond the viral clips, lies a lesson. Courage can shake the foundations of even the strongest institutions. Garland's silence wasn't just his, it became a symbol of a system exposed. Crockett's defense wasn't just hers, it became a rallying cry. But here's the truth, this story doesn't end here. More battles are coming, more voices will rise, and more moments will test who we are as a nation. And when they do, we'll need to remember this. Silence protects no one, but truth spoken boldly can change everything. If you felt the impact of Jasmine Crockett's defense, if you believe in holding power accountable, no matter how high it sits, then hit that subscribe button right now. Join this community, share this story, and be part of the movement to amplify voices that refuse to be silenced. Because history isn't written by those who stayed quiet. It's written by those who had the courage to speak when the world needed it most.